How Phaon the Terrible massacred 120,000 Mongol Horde horsemen. Imagine standing on a frozen river in the dead of Russian winter. The ground beneath your feet is cracking. The air smells like smoke, blood, and horse sweat. Somewhere behind you, a city is burning. And in front of you, stretching as far as your eyes can see, is a sea of horsemen. 120,000 Mongol warriors, the most feared cavalry force on the face of the earth. They have been terrorizing Russia for over 200 years. They have burned Moscow. They have taken Russian men, women, and children into slavery. They have made Russian princes crawl on their knees and beg for mercy. For generations, no Russian ruler had been able to stop them. But on this day, something was different. On this day, the man standing between Russia and that horde was not a frightened prince. He was a czar. He was a man who had watched his own mother get poisoned when he was a child. A man who had been beaten, humiliated, and spat on as a boy by the very nobles who were supposed to serve him. A man who had grown up in darkness and come out of it as something terrifying. His name was Ivan, and history would call him the Terrible. What happened next would change the fate of Russia forever. Stay with me, because this story is absolutely incredible. Welcome back to From Start to Now. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we cover the most intense, the most dramatic, and the most jaw-dropping moments in human history. And today, we are going deep into one of the most consequential military campaigns of the 16th century. We are talking about how Ivan the Terrible broke the back of the Mongol Horde once and for all. This is the story of the fall of Kazan and Astrakhan, the end of 250 years of Mongol domination, and the brutal genius of a tsar that history has both feared and misunderstood. Let's go from the very start. To understand what Ivan actually accomplished, you first have to understand the weight of what Russia was living under. Because this was not just a military conflict, this was a centuries-old trauma. And it starts with the Mongols arriving in Russia in the year 1237. When the Mongol armies of Batu Khan swept into the Russian lands, they did not just conquer, they annihilated. City after city fell. Ryazan was razed to the ground. Vladimir was burned. Kiev, one of the most beautiful and important cities in the medieval world, was reduced to rubble. Chronicles from the time describe rivers running red with blood and entire populations wiped out within days. The Russian historian Nikolai Karamzin would later write that it was as if the earth itself had shaken and swallowed the people whole. The Mongols established what became known as the Golden Horde, and for the next 2.5 centuries, the Russian principalities lived under their thumb. They paid tribute. They sent their princes crawling to the Mongol capital to receive permission to rule their own lands. They watched their people taken in slave raids, year after year after year. Now, technically, by the time Ivan was born in 1530, the unified Golden Horde had already collapsed, but that did not mean the threat was gone. Oh no, it had actually become more complicated in some ways. The old Golden Horde had splintered into successor states. You had the Khanate of Kazan to the east, right on Russia's doorstep, situated at the junction of the Volga and Kama rivers. You had the Khanate of Astrakhan, further south along the Volga. You had the Khanate of Crimea in the south, which had a very cozy relationship with the Ottoman Empire. And you had the Great Horde and the Nogai Horde wandering the steppes. These successor states still conducted slave raids into Russian territory on a regular basis. Some estimates suggest that over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, somewhere between 1 and 3 million Russians were taken into slavery by these Khanates and sold in markets stretching all the way to the Middle East and Central Asia. Think about that number for a moment. This was a wound that bled constantly. The Russian economy was being drained. Entire border regions were being depopulated, and Moscow was spending enormous resources just on defense, just trying to protect what it already had. This was the world Ivan was born into, and Ivan's childhood made it even more personal, more raw, more visceral. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, actually ruled as regent for a few years and showed real political skill, but she died when Ivan was 8. and there is very strong suspicion, supported by modern forensic analysis of her remains, which showed high concentrations of mercury, that she was poisoned by the powerful boyar families, the Russian noble class, who wanted to control the young prince and through him the state. So here is this 8-year-old boy, suddenly an orphan, surrounded by powerful men who are fighting each other for control. The Shuisky family and the Belsky family are essentially at war with each other, using the Kremlin as their battlefield. Ivan later wrote in his letters, and his writing is some of the most emotionally raw political correspondence you will ever read. He wrote about how the boyars would barge into his rooms at all hours, how they would ignore him or mock him, how he would sometimes go hungry because servants had stopped caring for him properly, how he watched men being beaten and killed in front of him. He described growing up like an orphan in a foreign land, even though it was his own palace. This did something to Ivan, and historians debate endlessly about whether what it did to him made him a genius, a monster, or some terrifying combination of both. By the time he was 13, he was already showing that combination. In 1543, he had the head of the Shuisky family, Andrei Shuisky, arrested and thrown to a pack of hunting dogs. He was 13 years old. The message was received, but he was not yet Tsar, not fully. That happened in 1547, when at the age of 16, Ivan did something no Russian ruler had done before. He had himself crowned not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all the Russias. The word Tsar comes from Caesar. It was a deliberate, loaded, almost audacious claim. Ivan was saying that Moscow was the third Rome, that after Rome and Constantinople had fallen, the true Christian empire now rested on Russian shoulders, and he, Ivan, was its emperor. Almost immediately after his coronation, Moscow caught fire, literally. A massive fire swept through the city in June 1547, killing thousands and leaving large parts of Moscow in ashes. Riots followed. Angry mobs stormed the Kremlin, killed one of Ivan's uncles, and nearly got to Ivan himself. Ivan fled to a village outside Moscow and apparently had something of a spiritual crisis, or a breakdown, or possibly both. And when he came back different. He gathered reformers around him, including a remarkable priest named Sylvester and a capable administrator named Alexei Adashev, and he launched a program of genuine government reform, new law codes, a new administrative structure, attempts to curb the worst abuses of the nobility. Historians who focus only on the later, darker Ivan often gloss over this period. But in the late 1540s and early 1550s, Ivan was doing something that looked a lot like building a modern state. And it was in this context, this combination of personal rage, imperial ambition, genuine state building, and the very real security needs of a country under constant threat, that Ivan turned his attention to Kazan. The Khanate of Kazan had been a thorn in Russia's side for generations, not just in terms of slave raids, though those were devastating enough. Kazan sat at one of the most strategically important points in all of Eastern Europe. Control the Kazan junction on the Volga, and you controlled trade flowing through the heart of Eurasia. You control access to the fur trade of Siberia. You control the river routes that connected Russia to Persia and Central Asia. Ivan understood this. He did not just want revenge, though there was certainly revenge in his heart. He wanted to open Russia up. He wanted to turn Russia from a besieged fortress into an expanding empire. There had been Russian attempts to take Kazan before. Ivan's predecessors had tried multiple times. They had all failed. The city was incredibly well defended, sitting on a high bluff above the Kazanka River, where it meets the Volga, surrounded by strong walls, and defended by a formidable garrison. Russian armies had gotten there, looked at those walls, and eventually gone home. In 1547 and again in 1549, Ivan himself led campaigns toward Kazan, and both times he had to turn back. The logistics were brutal. Getting Remy that far east with enough supplies was an enormous challenge, and the Kazanese defenders knew the terrain far better than the Russians did. But Ivan was learning, and he was doing something that his predecessors had not done systematically. He was building. In 1551, just 30 kilometers from Kazan, at the confluence of the Sviaga and Volga rivers, Ivan did something astonishing. He had an entire fortress city prefabricated in the forests around Uklich, far to the north. Every log, every plank, every tower component was cut, shaped, numbered, and transported down the Volga. And then, in an almost incomprehensibly short period of just 28 days, the fortress of Sviazk was assembled from scratch. 28 days to build a city. This was a forward base, a supply depot, a staging ground. And it was a psychological shock to everyone watching because it showed the kind of organizational capability and determination that had never been demonstrated by a Russian ruler before. Now Ivan assembled his forces, and this was no ordinary medieval army shuffling to war. Ivan had been investing in military modernization for years. He had created the streltsy, professional infantry equipped with firearms. He had artillery, and not just a few cannons, but a substantial artillery train that included massive siege guns. He had recruited foreign engineers, particularly from Germany and Eastern Europe, who understood the latest techniques in siege warfare. And he had his cavalry and his traditional forces as well. The total force that converged on Kazan in the summer of 1552 numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 150,000 men, depending on which source you read, with the more conservative estimates probably being closer to the truth. But even at the lower estimates, this was an enormous force by the standards of the time. The siege began in August of 1552. The city of Kazan, under its Khan Yadega Muhammad, and defended by around 30,000 warriors plus the civilian population, prepared to resist. The defenders were not passive. They mounted sorties. They harassed the Russian lines. And they had a secret weapon that caused Ivan's army serious trouble in the early stages. There was a system of underground springs beneath Kazan that supplied the city with fresh water, meaning a simple siege of starvation and thirst was not going to work easily. The Russian engineers figured this out, and in what was one of the great feats of military engineering of the 16th century, they dug a countermine to locate and destroy those underground water sources. This was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous work, digging beneath the foundations of an enemy fortification, while that enemy was doing everything they could to stop you. Ivan's engineers, and here the role of a German engineer named Rosmiesel appears in the chronicles, also dug tunnels under the walls of Kazan itself, with the intention of packing them with gunpowder. This was the technology of the age. Before you had heavy enough artillery to simply batter down walls, you could try to literally blow them up from underneath. And on October 2nd, 1552, after weeks of siege and preparation, the Russians detonated those mines. The explosion was described in the chronicles as something that shook the earth for miles. Sections of Kazan's walls simply ceased to exist, and through those gaps poured the Russian army. The fighting inside the city was savage. Street by street, building by building, the Kazanese defenders fought with everything they had. The Russian chronicles describe a battle of incredible ferocity, with defenders fighting from rooftops and from within buildings, refusing to surrender. The Khan himself was captured trying to escape by river. The city fell, but it did not surrender. It had to be taken at enormous cost in Russian blood as well. Ivan entered the city on October 2nd, and it is said that he wept at the sight of it. Whether those were tears of joy, grief, or both, no one can say for certain. But Kazan had fallen. For the first time in Russian history, a major Mongol successor state had been decisively destroyed. The numbers associated with this campaign are staggering. The Khanate of Kazan had been mobilizing forces across its territory, and the estimates of fighters and their supporters that were engaged or killed throughout the entire campaign, including the battles leading up to and following the fall of the city, run into the tens of thousands. When you combine this with the subsequent campaigns, the total killed in the wars against the Khanates over this period reaches those figures of 120,000 that historians have cited. This was not just one battle. This was the systematic destruction of a military and political order, and it was far from over. The reaction in Russia was explosive. Ivan returned to Moscow as a hero of almost legendary proportions. The celebrations were unlike anything the city had ever seen. and Ivan commissioned the construction of a building to mark the victory that would become one of the most iconic structures in the world. St. Basil's Cathedral, that incredible swirling confection of colored domes that still stands in Red Square today, was built to commemorate the taking of Kazan. There is a famous legend that Ivan had the architects blinded after its completion, so they could never build anything more beautiful for anyone else. Modern historians are skeptical of that story, but the fact that it circulated and was believed tells you something about how people perceived Ivan. Even his greatest moments had darkness swirling around them, but the work was not done. Kazan had fallen, but the step beyond it was Ot pacified. The Nogai Horde and other groups were still active, and further south, Astrakhan, the other major khanate on the Volga, remained independent. Astrakhan actually fell much more easily than Kazan had. Ivan sent an army south in 1554, and the Khan of Astrakhan, rather than fight, fled. A pro-Russian ruler was installed. The following year, when the situation there became unstable again, Ivan sent another army, and this time the Russian hold was made permanent. By 1556, Astrakhan was incorporated into the Russian state. Ivan was not yet 30 years old, and he had accomplished something that no Russian ruler in 2.5 centuries had managed. The entire length of the Volga River, from its source to the Caspian Sea, was now Russian. The great trade artery of Eastern Europe was in Russian hands, and the two most powerful successor states of the Golden Horde had been eliminated. The scale of the military achievement is hard to overstate. In terms of territory, Ivan had added an area roughly the size of Western Europe to the Russian state in just a few years. The conquest of Kazan alone opened the door to the entire Siberian frontier. Within a few decades, Russian explorers and Cossack adventurers would be pushing all the way to the Pacific Ocean, a process that would eventually give Russia the largest territorial footprint of any nation in history. And it all flowed from what Ivan accomplished on those banks of the Volga in 1552. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Ivan did not stop there, and the things he did after these great victories cast a very long shadow over everything that came before. The famous Oprichnina, the period of state-sponsored terror that Ivan launched in 1565, the destruction of Novgorod in 1570, where he massacred thousands of his own people in a fit of paranoid rage, the murder of his own son in 1581 in an uncontrolled-led moment of violence that Ivan apparently regretted for the rest of his life. All of these things are inseparable from the full picture of the man. The word terrible in his nickname does not actually translate from the Russian terrifying or evil the way we might think. The Russian word grozny is closer to awesome in the old sense, dread-inspiring, formidable, someone who commands awe and fear simultaneously. But the terror was real, and Ivan earned that reputation thoroughly in the later years of his reign. What happened to him? Why did the man who reformed the Russian state, who crushed the Mongol Khanates, who built St. Basil's Cathedral, why did he become the man who ordered the Oprichnina? This is one of the great psychological mysteries of history. Some historians point to the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560. Ivan's grief was reportedly overwhelming, and he became convinced, probably correctly, that she had been poisoned by enemies within the court. The reform-minded advisors Sylvester and Adashev had already fallen from favor. Ivan felt surrounded by traitors, and his response to that feeling was to build an entirely new power structure, the Oprichnina, which was essentially a state within a state, a private domain under his personal control, with its own army, the Oprichniki, who functioned as a combination of secret police, death squad, and instrument of pure terror. The Oprichniki wore black, rode black horses, and carried a dog's head and a broom on their saddles, symbolizing that they were Ivan's dogs, who would sniff out and sweep away treachery. The war in the West, the Livonian War that Ivan launched in 1558, trying to gain access to the Baltic Sea and to the trade routes and diplomatic connections that came with it, was going badly by the 1560s. Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden had entered the conflict, and Russia was losing ground. Ivan, who had achieved brilliant success in the East, was experiencing failure in the West, and that failure seemed to accelerate his paranoia and his cruelty. The Livonian War would drag on for 25 years and end in disaster for Russia, losing the gains Ivan had briefly made and leaving the western frontier exposed. But none of this changes what he accomplished against the Mongol successor states. If anything, it makes the achievement more interesting, not less, because you can see in Ivan both the architect of Russian greatness and the author of Russian suffering within the same human being in the same reign. He is not a simple story. He never was. Let's bring this into a wider context for a moment, because what Ivan did to the Mongol Horde needs to be understood in the sweep of world history. The fall of Kazan in 1552 was happening at the exact same time that the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was at the peak of its power, that the Spanish Empire was conquering vast swaths of the Americas, that China, under the Ming dynasty, was dealing with its own frontier crises. It was a world in violent motion, with old powers being destroyed and new ones rising. And in that world, the Russian conquest of the Khanates was not just a regional event, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The Crimean Khanate, backed by Ottoman power, understood what had happened and was deeply alarmed. In 1571, the Crimean Khan Devlet Giray actually managed to march all the way to Moscow and burn it. This is often forgotten in the triumphant narrative of Ivan's eastern victories. Even as Kazan and Astrakhan had been absorbed, the Crimean threat remained, and it would remain a source of pressure on Russia for another 2 centuries until Catherine the Great finally dealt with it in the late 1700s. So Ivan's victories, while real and massive, were not the end of the Mongol threat entirely. They were a decisive turning point, not a complete resolution. But the turning point mattered enormously. Before 1552, Russia was a country on the defensive. After 1556, Russia was a country on the offensive. The psychological shift was profound. Russian thinkers and churchmen began articulating an ideology of Moscow as the protector of all Orthodox Christians, as the successor to the Roman and Byzantine empires, as a world power with a divine mission. This ideology, which was always there in embryonic form, became real and practical because of Ivan's victories. The land, the resources, the strategic security that came from controlling the Volga, all of this made the ideology feel like something more than wishful thinking. It felt like destiny being fulfilled. And the demographics shifted as well. The Russian state began colonizing the newly acquired eastern territories aggressively. Russian peasants, craftsmen, and traders moved into the Volga region. Cossack communities expanded their range dramatically. The indigenous peoples of these regions, the Tatar populations who had lived under the Khanates, were incorporated into the Russian state in various ways, some becoming loyal subjects and serving in Russian armies, others resisting and being suppressed, still others moving further east or south to escape Russian control. This was not a gentle process. Conquests rarely are, but the result was the creation of the multi-ethnic Eurasian state that Russia remains to this day. There is also the question of what the fall of the Khanates meant for the slave trade that had been bleeding Russia for so long. With Kazan and Astrakhan gone, one major source of those raids was eliminated. The Crimean raids would continue, and they were devastating right through the 17th century. But the Volga route, the eastern approach, was closed. Russian border communities that had lived in terror of Kazan's cavalry could begin to breathe. Farmsteads could be established in areas that had previously been too dangerous. Trade could move more freely. The economic impact over the following decades was enormous. Now let's come back to Ivan himself one more time, because I want to make sure we give this man his full due as a military and strategic thinker, regardless of the horrors he later perpetrated. What Ivan accomplished in the campaign against Kazan specifically was a masterclass in what we might today call combined arms warfare and operational planning. He understood that you could not just throw cavalry at a fortified city. You needed artillery, you needed engineering, you needed logistics, which meant the brilliant innovation of Sviazk, that prefabricated fortress that he had built in 28 days. He understood that a campaign of this scale required a base of operations, required supply lines, required infrastructure, He was thinking at a level of strategic sophistication that his predecessors had not demonstrated. He also understood the political dimensions of warfare, the various internal factions within Kazan, the tensions between different clans and leaders, the possibility of finding allies within or near the enemy. These were all things Ivan and his advisors worked carefully. When a pro-Russian candidate for the Kazan throne was available, Ivan used him. When that approach failed, he went to direct conquest. He was flexible and pragmatic in his methods, even if his ultimate goals were uncompromising. The use of engineering, particularly the tunnel mines, was cutting edge for the time. The technology of digging tunnels under fortifications and packing them with gunpowder had been developed and used in Western European warfare, but Ivan brought it east and used it decisively. This required not just engineering skill but enormous organizational capacity, the ability to coordinate hundreds or thousands of men digging in shifts under enemy walls while under constant attack. The success of that operation was one of the key factors in Kazan's fall. And there is one more thing I want to highlight about Ivan's campaign that often gets overlooked: the speed and decisiveness of the follow-through. After Kazan fell in October 1552, Ivan did not just declare victory and go home, he put in place administrative structures immediately. He began the process of integrating the territory into the Russian state. He understood that conquest without consolidation is meaningless. The fact that Astrakhan fell just 2 years later was not an accident. It was the logical next step in a planned strategic expansion. The Volga had to be Russian from top to bottom, and Ivan made that happen in a time frame that by the standards of 16th century logistics was extraordinarily rapid. So what is the legacy of all this? When we look at the Russia of today, with its vast Eurasian expanse, with its mixture of peoples and cultures and landscapes stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, we are looking at something that began, in a very real sense, in the autumn of 1552, on the banks of the Volga. Ivan cracked open the door to Eurasia and Russia walked through it. The Cossack explorer Yermak's conquest of Siberia in the 1580s, which is another incredible story for another day, was possible only because Kazan had fallen. The Russian presence in Central Asia that would eventually become a major factor in the great geopolitical game of the 19th century, all of that flows back to Ivan's victories. The sheer territorial ambition that became a defining feature of Russian statecraft, the sense that Russia must be vast or it is nothing, that instinct was fed and legitimized by what Ivan accomplished. And there is something deeply human in this story that I find endlessly fascinating. This was a man who had every reason to be broken. He watched his mother die, possibly murdered. He was mistreated and humiliated through his childhood. He grew up in an environment of constant conspiracy and violence. And he could have emerged from all of that as simply a broken, paranoid ruler who lashed out randomly and accomplished nothing. Instead, in the first half of his reign, he emerged as something extraordinary, a genuine state builder, a military innovator, a man who changed the map of the world. And then, in the second half of his reign, the darkness that had always been there consumed him. The paranoia, the cruelty, the terror. And so we are left with this impossible contradictory figure who is all of those things simultaneously. Ivan the Terrible died in March 1584. He was 53 years old, ancient by the standards of the time, and he had been in decline in health for years, his body wrecked by some combination of disease, and, according to some researchers who have analyzed his remains, quite possibly mercury poisoning, which was used as a medicine at the time. He died mid-game of chess by some accounts, which feels almost too perfectly symbolic for a man whose entire life was a game of strategy, played at the highest possible stakes, with the most brutal possible consequences. He left Russia transformed, not just in terms of territory, though the territorial transformation was immense. He left it transformed in terms of how Russia was an empire. Not officially, not yet. Peter the Great would formalize that title over a century later, but in reality, in the scope of its ambitions and the scale of its reach, Russia became imperial under Ivan, the Mongol Horde, that 2.5-century nightmare that had shaped Russian civilization in so many ways, including perhaps even giving the Russian autocratic tradition some of its character, was broken. Not perfectly, not completely, but decisively. The balance of power on the Eurasian steppe had shifted, and it would never shift back. 120,000 Mongol Horde horsemen. That number encompasses not just the fighters killed in the siege of Kazan, but the cumulative human cost of the campaigns against Kazan, Astrakhan, and the various steppe forces that Russia fought through this period. It is a staggering number, and behind every one of those numbers is a human story, a warrior who rode out one morning, believing in his cause and his Khan and his people. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a story of two civilizations, both of them capable of great beauty and great violence, colliding over centuries and finally reaching a turning point. Russia survived. More than survived, it expanded. And the man who made that happen, for all his brilliance and all his horror, left a mark on history that has never faded. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, first of all, thank you so much. That genuinely means everything to this channel. And second, let me know in the comments below what you think about Ivan. Is he a hero who saved Russia? A monster who terrorized his own people? Or is he something more complicated than either of those labels? Because I think history is almost always more complicated than the simple labels. And Ivan might be one of the most extreme examples of that in all of history. Drop your thoughts below. Share this video if you found it interesting, because these stories deserve to be heard. And if you have not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We have got so many more incredible stories to tell. From the siege of Kazan to the halls of the Kremlin, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the sun-baked steppes of Central Asia, history is out there, and we are going to cover all of it. Hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and we will see you in the next one.